Please don't leave my daughter alone." The dying cop's whisper cut through the rain-soaked alley. Brian Robinson, single dad and paramedic, found her bleeding out behind the dumpster at 3 a.m., badge still clutched in her hand. She grabbed his wrist with shocking strength. "Promise me!" He promised. What he didn't know was that saving Officer Eliana Diaz would cost him everything and give him more than he ever imagined. 2 weeks earlier, the promise was made. But before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories that will touch your heart. Brian Robinson had exactly one rule for his 7-year-old daughter Sophie: never go to bed angry. No matter how exhausted he was after a 12-hour shift as a paramedic, no matter how many critical calls he'd run, he always came home, kissed Sophie's forehead, and asked about her day. It was the rule he and his wife Melissa had made together back when Sophie was just 2 years old, and their biggest worry was teething. That was 5 years ago, before the cancer diagnosis, before the treatments that didn't work, before Melissa's final words to him in the hospice bed: "Don't let our baby girl forget how to be happy." Brian had kept that promise for 3 years now, raising Sophie alone in their modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. His mother Helen helped with childcare, staying with Sophie during his overnight shifts at New York Presbyterian Hospital. It wasn't perfect, but they'd found their rhythm. Sophie was thriving in 2nd grade, making friends, bringing home art projects that Brian taped to every available wall surface. He worked the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., because it paid slightly more, and every dollar mattered when you were raising a kid on a single income in New York City. The calls varied wildly: heart attacks in Manhattan penthouses, overdoses in Bronx alleys, car accidents on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Brian had seen everything in his 8 years as a paramedic, but he'd never become numb to it. Every patient mattered. Every life was worth fighting for. His partner Marcus Wu had been riding with him for 2 years now, and they'd developed the kind of wordless communication that only came from shared crisis. Marcus was older, 45 to Brian's 33, with 2 teenage sons and a wife who taught high school English. He'd mentored Brian through the darkest months after Melissa's death, covering shifts when Brian couldn't function, never judging when grief made him snappy or distant. "You're a good dad," Marcus would say whenever Brian apologized for being distracted. "Sophie's lucky to have you." Brian didn't always feel like a good dad. He felt like a guy trying desperately not to drown, working overnight shifts and sleeping in fragments during the day, missing school plays and parent-teacher conferences because he was unconscious from exhaustion. Helen insisted he was doing great, that Sophie was happy and healthy and loved, but the guilt never quite disappeared. The night everything changed started like any other Wednesday. Brian had dropped Sophie at Helen's apartment at 10:30, her overnight bag packed with her favorite stuffed rabbit and the homework she'd finished at dinner. Sophie had hugged him tight, whispered, "Love you, Daddy," and disappeared into Helen's living room where a Disney movie was already playing. "Drive safe," Helen had called after him. "Weather report says possible thunderstorms." The shift started quiet. A diabetic emergency in Chelsea, resolved with glucose and monitoring. A slip and fall in Times Square. Tourist with a sprained ankle more embarrassed than injured. Marcus bought terrible coffee from a bodega on their break, and they sat in the ambulance discussing Marcus's younger son's college applications and Sophie's upcoming birthday party. "She wants a science-themed party," Brian had explained, shaking his head in bemusement. 7 years old, and she wants to do experiments with baking soda volcanoes and slime. "Melissa's daughter for sure," Marcus had said with a grin. "Your wife was brilliant. Sophie's going to be a scientist, watch." The call came in at 2:47 a.m. Dispatch reported an assault in progress near a warehouse district in Long Island City. Possible victim down, police responding. It wasn't technically a paramedic call yet, no confirmation of injuries, but they were the closest unit. Brian and Marcus responded anyway, lights and sirens cutting through the rain that had started falling 20 minutes earlier. They arrived before the police. The warehouse district was industrial and mostly abandoned at night, a maze of narrow alleys between brick buildings that dated back to the 1950s. Rain hammered the ambulance roof as Brian and Marcus grabbed their kits and approached the location dispatch had provided. "NYPD should be here," Marcus muttered, scanning the dark alley warily. "We're not supposed to enter an active scene without police securing it." "I hear something," Brian said, stopping. "Listen." Through the rain, a faint sound, gasping, someone struggling to breathe. Brian's training overrode his caution. Someone needed help. He moved toward the sound, Marcus following reluctantly, both of them calling out to identify themselves as paramedics. Behind a commercial dumpster, Brian found her. A woman in her late 20s lying in a spreading pool of blood that the rain was diluting into pink streams. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a leather jacket, but her hand clutched an NYPD detective's badge, and Brian could see a service weapon partially visible under her jacket. She'd been stabbed multiple times, defensive wounds on her forearms, a critical wound in her abdomen. "Marcus, get a gurney now." Brian dropped to his knees beside her, hands already moving through the initial assessment. Airway, breathing, circulation. She was conscious but barely, her breathing shallow and rapid, skin cold and clammy. Shock. Massive blood loss. Minutes away from death if they didn't move fast. "Stay with me," Brian said clearly, making eye contact. Her eyes were dark brown, unfocused with shock but still aware. "I'm Brian. I'm a paramedic. You're going to be okay. Can you tell me your name?" "Eli. Anna," she managed, voice barely audible over the rain. "Diaz. Detective." "Okay, Eliana. I've got you. Just stay with me." Brian was already applying pressure to the abdominal wound, shouting instructions to Marcus, who'd returned with the gurney. They needed to stop the bleeding, get fluids running, get her to a trauma center within 10 minutes, or she wouldn't make it. Eliana's hand suddenly grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her eyes focused on him with desperate intensity. "My daughter," she gasped. "Maya, 7 years old. If something happens—" "You're going to be fine," Brian said firmly, even as he saw the volume of blood loss and mentally calculated her chances. Not good. Maybe 30% survival even with perfect treatment. "We're going to get you to the hospital. Promise me." Eliana's grip tightened. Blood flecked her lips. "Don't let my daughter be alone. Promise." In that moment, looking into the dying woman's eyes, Brian saw himself, saw the fear of leaving a child without a parent, saw the desperation of a single mother facing death and knowing her daughter would be orphaned. He didn't think. He just responded with his heart. "I promise," Brian said. "Your daughter won't be alone. I promise." Eliana's grip relaxed slightly. She nodded once, a tiny movement, and then her eyes rolled back as consciousness faded. Brian and Marcus moved instantly into emergency protocol, getting her onto the gurney, running 2 large-bore IVs, applying pressure dressings, securing her airway. The ambulance screamed toward Elmhurst Hospital, the nearest Level 1 trauma center, with Brian in back doing everything possible to keep Eliana alive. She coded twice during the 8-minute transport. Brian brought her back both times with CPR and medications, refusing to give up, remembering his promise. Marcus drove like his own life depended on it, shaving precious seconds off the route. When they crashed through the ambulance bay doors at Elmhurst, the trauma team was waiting, and Brian gave the fastest, most complete handoff report of his career before they wheeled Eliana into surgery. Detective Eliana Diaz, late 20s, multiple stab wounds including penetrating abdominal trauma, estimated 4-liter blood loss, 2 cardiac arrests in transport, currently on pressors and maxed out fluids. She needs ore now. The trauma surgeon nodded grimly, and the team disappeared through the surgical suite doors. Brian stood in the hallway covered in Eliana's blood, hands shaking with post-adrenaline crash. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. "You did everything right," Marcus said quietly. "Everything possible." "I promised her," Brian said, his voice rough. "She asked me to take care of her daughter if she died. I promised." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "You don't even know this woman." "She's a mother," Brian said simply. "She was dying and afraid her daughter would be alone." What was I supposed to say? The NYPD arrived 20 minutes later, uniformed officers first, then detectives from the 108th precinct where Eliana worked. Brian and Marcus gave their statements, describing exactly where and how they'd found her. The detectives were tight-lipped, but Brian gathered enough to understand. Eliana had been working undercover, investigating a weapons trafficking operation. She'd been made. The attack was an attempted murder, not a random assault. "Is she going to make it?" asked Detective Sergeant Rodriguez, a stocky man in his 50s with tired eyes. "Diaz is one of our best. She's been on this case for 8 months." "I don't know," Brian admitted. "She lost a lot of blood. She coded twice before we got here. If she survives the surgery, the next 48 hours will tell." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "She mentioned her daughter, Maya." "Yes. She asked me to—" Brian hesitated. "She asked me to make sure her daughter wasn't alone if she didn't make it." Rodriguez's expression softened. "Eliana's divorced. Custody split with her ex-husband David, but he's deployed overseas with the Navy. 6th-month deployment, left 3 months ago. Maya's been staying with Eliana's mother, Rosa, but Rosa just had a stroke 2 weeks ago. She's in rehab, can't care for a kid. It's been a logistics nightmare. Eliana was trying to arrange alternative care, but the case went critical and—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Brian felt something cold settle in his stomach. "So if Eliana doesn't survive, her daughter has no one. David would have to take emergency leave and come back from deployment, which could take days or weeks depending on where his ship is. In the meantime, Maya would go into emergency foster care, unless family can be found." Rodriguez studied Brian carefully. "Why do you ask?" "I promised her," Brian said. "I told her daughter wouldn't be alone." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "That's a big promise to make to a stranger." "I know," Brian said, "but I meant it." The surgery lasted 6 hours. Brian and Marcus finished their shift, filed their reports, cleaned the ambulance, and clocked out at 7 a.m. Brian should have gone straight home to shower and sleep before picking up Sophie from Helen's. Instead, he found himself in the Elmhurst Hospital cafeteria, drinking terrible coffee and waiting for news about Eliana Diaz. Marcus had gone home to his family, but not before making Brian promise to call if he needed anything. "You've got a big heart," Marcus had said. "But don't forget, you've got your own daughter to take care of. Sophie needs you." "I know," Brian had replied, "but I made a promise." At 8:30 a.m., the trauma surgeon found Brian in the cafeteria. "Doctor." Sarah Chen looked exhausted, still in surgical scrubs, but her expression was cautiously optimistic. "You're the paramedic who brought in Detective Diaz?" Brian stood up immediately. "How is she?" "Alive, barely. We repaired a lacerated bowel, stopped the bleeding, gave her 6 units of blood. She's critical but stable. Next 48 hours are crucial. Infection risk is high, and she could still deteriorate. But she's a fighter. Most people wouldn't have survived what she went through." Relief flooded through Brian so intensely he had to sit back down. Thank you so much." Dr. Chen sat down across from him. The detectives told me you made a promise to her about her daughter. That's unusual. I have a 7-year-old daughter, Brian said. My wife died 3 years ago. I'm raising Sophie alone. When Eliana grabbed my hand and begged me to make sure her daughter wasn't alone, I understood. I couldn't say no. Rosa Diaz, Eliana's mother, is actually in this hospital, Dr. Chen said. Stroke rehab on the 4th floor. She's coherent but physically impaired. The social worker has been trying to figure out care arrangements for Maya while Eliana recovers, assuming she recovers. If you're serious about helping, you could start by talking to Rosa. Brian checked his phone. 8:45. He needed to pick up Sophie by 9, get her to school by 9:30, then sleep before his next shift. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Eliana's desperate face, heard her voice. Don't let my daughter be alone. What room is Rosa in? Brian asked. Rosa Diaz was 62 years old, with steel-grey hair and her daughter's dark eyes. The stroke had partially paralyzed her left side, but her mind was sharp and her spirit unbroken. When Brian introduced himself and explained how he'd found Eliana, Rosa started crying. She was working, Rosa said in accented English, her words slightly slurred from the stroke. I told her be careful, that case was dangerous. But Eliana, she always wanted to help people, catch bad guys, like her father. He was police too, died in line of duty when Eliana was 12. I'm so sorry, Brian said, but Dr. Chen says Eliana's stable now. She's going to fight through this. And Maya? Rosa asked, her good hand gripping the bedrail. My granddaughter, who takes care of her? I cannot walk, cannot lift things. I try to leave hospital, but they say no, I need more rehab. David is on aircraft carrier somewhere in Pacific Ocean. Takes maybe 2 weeks to get emergency leave. Maya is with neighbor now, but neighbor has 3 kids already, cannot keep Maya forever. I promised Eliana I wouldn't let Maya be alone, Brian said carefully. I'm not sure exactly how to help, but I meant that promise. I'm a paramedic. I work overnight shifts, but I have a daughter the same age as Maya. If there's any way I can support you and Maya until Eliana recovers or David gets back, I'll do it. Rosa studied him for a long moment. You don't know us. Why you help? Because I'm a single parent too, Brian said honestly. My wife died 3 years ago. I understand how hard it is to raise a child alone, and how terrifying it is to think about your child being alone if something happens to you. Eliana was dying and afraid for her daughter. I couldn't ignore that. Rosa was quiet, tears streaming down her face. Finally she nodded. You are a good man, Eliana. She has good instinct about people. She trusts you in worst moment. I trust you too. Over the next 2 days, Brian learned the full story. Eliana Diaz, 29 years old, had been an NYPD detective for 3 years, working narcotics and organized crime. She'd been undercover for 8 months on a major weapons trafficking case, posing as a corrupt shipping inspector to infiltrate a ring moving illegal firearms from Virginia to New York. The night Brian found her, she'd been meeting an informant who turned out to be a trap. 3 men had ambushed her in the alley. She'd fought back, managed to wound one of them before they stabbed her and left her to die. She'd crawled behind the dumpster and called 911 before losing consciousness. Brian and Marcus had arrived before the police, probably saving her life by getting her to surgery 10 minutes faster than waiting for backup would have allowed. Maya Diaz was 7 years old, in 2nd grade at PS 212 in Queens, and by all accounts a sweet, brilliant child. She loved science and drawing, played soccer in a youth league, and had been desperately worried about her mother for months as Eliana worked increasingly dangerous undercover hours. Rosa had been caring for Maya during Eliana's unpredictable schedule until the stroke 2 weeks ago. Now Maya was staying with a neighbor family, the Patels, who had 3 kids of their own and were helping out of kindness but couldn't sustain it long term. David, Eliana's ex-husband, had been contacted and was requesting emergency leave, but the Navy bureaucracy was slow, and he was currently somewhere in the Western Pacific with limited communication. It could be 2 weeks before he could return to New York. Meanwhile, Eliana remained in critical condition in the ICU, sedated and on a ventilator, her body fighting infection and healing from massive trauma. Rosa improved daily in rehab, but still couldn't walk or care for a child. And Maya needed stability, needed to stay in her school, needed someone to take care of her. The social worker, Patricia Wong, laid out the options during a meeting Brian attended at Rosa's request. Temporary foster care, emergency custody to a family member if one could be identified, or voluntary temporary guardianship by an approved individual. "Mr. Robinson," Patricia said carefully, "you seem genuinely concerned about Maya's welfare, but you understand this would be a significant commitment. Temporary guardianship typically lasts weeks or months. You'd be legally responsible for Maya's care, safety, education, medical needs. That's in addition to your own parenting responsibilities for Sophie." "I understand," Brian said. "And I know this sounds crazy. I met Eliana for 10 minutes while she was dying. I don't have any connection to this family beyond a promise I made, but I can't walk away. Maya needs someone. Her grandmother approves. Her mother trusted me. I have the space. My apartment has a second bedroom where Maya could stay. My daughter Sophie is the same age, same grade even. My mother Helen helps with childcare during my work shifts. It's not perfect, but it could work until David gets back or Eliana recovers enough to take over." Patricia exchanged glances with Rosa, who nodded firmly. "I want this," Rosa said. "Brian is good man. Maya needs stability, not foster home with strangers. At least Brian cares. At least he promised Eliana." The paperwork took 3 days. Background checks, reference checks, home inspection, medical clearances. Brian had to take unpaid time off work to handle it all, which strained his already tight finances, but he couldn't stop now. He'd made a promise. More than that, he'd seen Maya's picture on Rosa's phone, a little girl with her mother's dark eyes and a gap-toothed smile holding a soccer ball, and he couldn't imagine her being alone and scared in foster care. He explained the situation to Sophie carefully, sitting her down after school one afternoon. "You know how Daddy's job is to help people who are hurt? You're a paramedic," Sophie said seriously. "You save lives." "That's right. Well, I helped a police officer who was very badly hurt. Her name is Officer Diaz. She's in the hospital recovering, but Officer Diaz has a daughter named Maya, who's your age, and her daughter needs somewhere safe to stay while her mom gets better. Would it be okay if Maya stayed with us for a while?" Sophie considered this with 7-year-old gravity. "Like a sleepover?" "A longer sleepover, maybe a few weeks or even a couple months. Maya would sleep in the guest room and go to school with you. She actually goes to your school, just a different classroom, but she'd be like a temporary sister. We'd take care of her until her mom is better." "Because you're a helper," Sophie said, nodding, "like Mommy always said. You help people." Brian felt his throat tighten. "Yes, because we help people, and because Maya needs us. Is that okay with you?" Sophie thought for a moment, then smiled. "I always wanted a sister." Maya Diaz moved into Brian's apartment on a Friday afternoon, 1 week after Brian had found her mother bleeding in an alley. She arrived with 2 suitcases of clothes, her backpack of school supplies, and a stuffed elephant named Peanut that she'd had since she was 2. The Patel family delivered her with obvious relief. They'd done their best, but 3 kids plus Maya was overwhelming their household. Maya was quiet and scared, her eyes red from crying. She'd visited her mother in the ICU twice under Rosa's supervision, but Eliana was still sedated and on the ventilator, unable to communicate. For a 7-year-old, it was traumatic and confusing. Her mum was alive but not awake. Her grandma was in the hospital but couldn't walk. Her dad was on a ship somewhere and couldn't come home yet. Nothing made sense. Brian knelt down to Maya's eye level in the apartment doorway. "Hi, Maya. I'm Brian. We met briefly at the hospital. This is my daughter Sophie and my mum Helen. We're really glad you're here. I know this is scary and confusing, but I promise you're safe here. We're going to take care of you until your mom is better or your dad gets home." Maya didn't respond verbally, just nodded slightly. Sophie, bless her resilient heart, stepped forward and took Maya's hand. "I'm Sophie. Want to see our room? Well, it's your room now, but it used to be my playroom. Dad put a bed in it for you, and I helped pick out the sheets. We got the space ones because I like space, and I thought maybe you might too." Maya looked at Sophie, then at the offered hand, and after a moment took it. Sophie led her down the hall, chattering about the apartment and school, and her stuffed rabbit Mr. Floppity, who was very excited to meet Maya's elephant Peanut. Brian watched them go, his heart full of something between fear and hope. Helen touched his shoulder. "You did a good thing, Brian. A hard thing, but a good thing." "I hope I can handle it," Brian admitted. 2 kids working nights, barely keeping up financially as it is. "You'll handle it," Helen said firmly, "because you're your mother's son, and we don't give up on people who need us. Now, I made lasagna. Let's get these girls fed and settled." The first week was an adjustment that tested every parenting skill Brian possessed. Maya was quiet and withdrawn, crying herself to sleep most nights, despite Sophie's attempts to comfort her through the shared wall between their rooms. She asked repeatedly when she could see her mom, whether her mom remembered her, whether the bad guys would come back, whether Brian was going to leave her too. "I'm not going anywhere," Brian would promise each time, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark hours before his shift. "You're safe here. Your mom is getting stronger. Your dad is coming as fast as he can. And until your family can take care of you again, my family is your family. That's what I promised your mom, and I never break my promises." Slowly, Maya began to believe him. Slowly, she started eating full meals instead of picking at her food. Slowly, she participated in school activities again, raising her hand in class, playing with other kids at recess. Sophie helped enormously, including Maya in every game, insisting Maya sleep in her room instead of alone, sharing her toys and books without being asked. Helen, bless her grandmother's heart, treated Maya exactly like she treated Sophie, with endless patience, firm boundaries, and unconditional love. She packed both girls identical lunches, braided both their hair in the mornings before school, listened to both their stories about their day with equal attention. Maya blossomed under that consistency, the uncertainty and fear gradually replaced by something like security. Brian arranged visits to the ICU twice a week after school, coordinating with Rosa's rehab schedule so grandmother and granddaughter could see Eliana together. The visits were hard. Eliana remained sedated in those early days, her body healing from massive trauma, tubes and monitors making her look fragile and unlike the strong mother Maya remembered. Maya would hold her mother's hand, talk to her about school and Sophie and the experiments they'd done, crying quietly while Rosa rubbed her back. "Mama can hear you," Rosa would say in Spanish. "Even when she sleeps, she hears you, mija. Keep talking to her." Progress was slow. Eliana was weaned off the ventilator after 4 days, but remained sedated and weak, her body fighting infection and healing from major surgery. The doctors explained to Brian privately that the abdominal injuries had been severe, requiring multiple repairs, and recovery would take months, not weeks. Infection risk remained high. There were complications, fluid around her lungs, kidney stress from the blood loss, pain management challenges. every day she survived was a victory. The weapons trafficking case she'd been investigating had blown open like a dam bursting. The NYPD conducted coordinated raids across 3 boroughs, arresting 6 primary suspects and 14 associates, seizing over 300 illegal firearms and dismantling the entire smuggling operation. The evidence Eliana had meticulously gathered over 8 months. Surveillance photos, recorded conversations, shipping manifests, financial transactions, provided everything prosecutors needed for airtight cases. Detective Sergeant Rodriguez visited Brian's apartment to update him and check on Maya, bringing flowers from the precinct and a massive card signed by dozens of officers expressing support for Eliana's recovery. He sat at Brian's small kitchen table drinking coffee while the girls played in Sophie's room, their laughter drifting down the hall. The district attorney's office is calling it the biggest weapons bust in 5 years, Rodriguez said. Those guns would have been on the streets within weeks, used in crimes, killing people. Eliana stopped that. She was willing to risk everything to get those weapons off the street. She almost died for it, Brian said quietly. She did, Rodriguez agreed. And she knew the risks. That's what makes her a hero. She chose to face danger to protect strangers she'd never meet. That's the job. That's what police officers do. But it doesn't make it easier for families, for Maya. How long was she undercover? Brian asked. 8 months. Started last winter as a supposed corrupt shipping inspector who could be bribed to look the other way. Built trust slowly with the trafficking ring, documented everything, worked her way up the chain until she was meeting with the primary organizers. The night you found her, she'd been meeting an informant who'd promised information about the ring's financial backers. Turned out it was a setup. 3 of them ambushed her. Rodriguez pulled out his phone, showing Brian photos from the arrest reports. These are the 3 who attacked Eliana. Gang members working security for the trafficking operation. The one Eliana managed to stab before they left her to die. This one here, Franklin Cortez. His wound got infected and he ended up in the emergency room. That's how we identified and caught all 3 of them. Her fighting back saved the case. Brian looked at the photos. Young men, early 20s, with dead eyes and criminal records that filled screens. They'd tried to murder Eliana in cold blood, stabbed her repeatedly, and left her to bleed out in that alley. Rage and helplessness warred in Brian's chest. What'll happen to them? Multiple charges. Attempted murder of a police officer carries serious time. With the weapons charges and the trafficking evidence, they're looking at 25 to life each. They'll die in prison, basically. And good riddance. Rodriguez pocketed his phone. But none of that helps Maya right now. How's she doing? Really? She's coping, Brian said honestly. Some days are better than others. Sophie helps. Having another kid around keeps her distracted. My mother is amazing with her, but she's still scared. She has nightmares. She cries when she thinks no one's listening. She's 7 years old, and her whole world got turned upside down. And you're caring for her on top of working overnight shifts and raising your own daughter, Rodriguez observed. That can't be easy. It's not, Brian admitted. I'm exhausted constantly. I'm behind on bills because I took unpaid time off to handle guardianship paperwork. I'm worried I'm not giving Sophie enough attention because Maya needs so much. But I made a promise, and Eliana trusted me with her daughter. I can't let her down. Diaz is a hero, Rodriguez said quietly. She got stabbed 3 times and still managed to wound one of the attackers and call for help. The evidence she gathered over 8 months made these arrests possible, saved lives, stopped violence. When she wakes up, she's getting a medal, departments recommending Medal of Valor. But more importantly, she's getting her daughter back, because of you. I just kept a promise, Brian said. Most people don't keep promises to dying strangers, Rodriguez replied. Most people would have done the minimum, called child services, made sure the kid ended up with someone official, moved on with their lives. You invited a traumatized 7-year-old you'd never met into your home. You're caring for her like she's your own daughter. You're sacrificing sleep and money and time you don't have because you told a bleeding cop in an alley that her kid wouldn't be alone. That's not just keeping a promise. That's extraordinary. You're good people, Brian Robinson. Sophie and Maya bonded slowly but surely, their friendship developing with the organic ease of children who recognize kindred spirits. They attended the same school, PS 212, though in different second-grade classrooms, Maya in Mrs. Patterson's class, Sophie in Mr. Chen's. Brian arranged for them to ride the bus together each morning, Sophie waiting at the bus stop to make sure Maya didn't have to stand alone, holding her hand when Maya seemed scared of the loud older kids. Helen picked them up every afternoon, taking them to her apartment where she'd prepared snacks and had art supplies ready. The girls would burst through the door talking over each other about their days, showing Helen artwork and spelling tests, demanding she admire their accomplishments. Helen treated them identically, praising both, correcting both when needed, loving both without reservation. Brian would arrive around 4 p.m. to collect them, groggy from insufficient sleep, but forcing himself alert to hear about their days. He'd take them back to his apartment, help with homework, prepare dinner, supervise baths, read bedtime stories. By the time he left for his 11 p.m. shift, both girls were usually asleep, and Helen would arrive to stay overnight in case they woke. Sophie's natural exuberance slowly coaxed Maya out of her shell like sunshine melting frost. They did homework together at Brian's dining table, Sophie helping Maya with math problems Maya found difficult, Maya helping Sophie with reading comprehension where Sophie struggled. They played together, creating elaborate imaginary worlds with dolls and action figures, building blanket forts in the living room, putting on theatrical performances for Helen and Brian, featuring songs they made up and costumes assembled from random clothes. They fought occasionally too, over toys or TV shows, or who got to sit in the front seat, or whose turn it was to pick the bedtime story. Real sibling squabbles that Brian mediated with patience, teaching them to compromise and apologize. Those fights, oddly, seemed to bring them closer, establishing that they could disagree and still love each other. Maya loved science as much as Sophie did, a shared passion that fueled countless experiments and investigations. They spent hours conducting experiments with baking soda and vinegar, creating explosive volcanoes and fizzing potions. They built structures with toothpicks and marshmallows, testing different configurations for stability and height. They looked at leaves under the magnifying glass Brian had bought them, documenting differences in a notebook with careful crayon drawings. They collected rocks and tried to identify them using a library book, creating a museum display on the bookshelf in Sophie's room. At night, Maya still cried sometimes. Brian would hear it through the thin walls and go to her room, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark. "I miss my mum," Maya would whisper. "I know," Brian would say gently, "but your mum is strong. She's fighting to get better so she can come home to you. And until then, you're safe here. I promised your mum I'd take care of you, and I always keep my promises." "Sophie's mum died," Maya said one night. "She told me." Brian's throat tightened. "Yes. Sophie's mum, my wife Melissa, died 3 years ago. It was very hard. It's still hard sometimes." "Are you scared my mum will die too?" Maya asked. Brian could have lied, could have given false reassurance, but Melissa had taught him that children deserved honesty. "I was scared when I first found your mum. She was hurt very badly, but she made it to the hospital, and the doctors saved her, and now she's getting stronger every day. I'm not scared anymore. I believe she's going to be okay." "My mum is strong," Maya said fiercely. "She fights bad guys." "She does. Brian agreed. She's a hero, and heroes don't give up. 2 weeks after moving in, Maya started smiling again. Small smiles at first, then bigger ones. She laughed at Sophie's jokes, participated in school activities, ate meals without prompting. The Patel family invited her to their daughter Priya's birthday party, and Maya went and had fun, coming home with cake and stories about the games they'd played. Rosa continued improving in rehab, graduating from wheelchair to walker. Brian brought the girls to visit her 3 times a week, and Rosa's face would light up every time. "You are thriving, mija," she'd tell Maya in Spanish. "I am so proud of you for being brave." Eliana's recovery followed a slower trajectory. She was weaned off sedation, but remained weak and in pain, dealing with complications from the abdominal injuries and fighting off infection. She couldn't have visitors beyond immediate family at first, so Brian didn't meet her while conscious until nearly 3 weeks after finding her in that alley. Detective Sergeant Rodriguez arranged it, clearing Brian as a special visitor since he was Maya's temporary guardian. Brian entered the ICU room nervously, unsure what to say to the woman whose life he'd saved and whose daughter he'd been caring for. Eliana was propped up in the hospital bed, still connected to multiple IVs and monitors, but alert and aware. She looked smaller than he remembered, diminished by trauma and weight loss, but her dark eyes were sharp and focused when they met his. "You're Brian," she said, her voice hoarse from the ventilator tube that had only been removed days earlier. "The paramedic." "Yes," Brian said, stepping closer. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got stabbed 3 times, Eliana said with a weak attempt at humor. Then her expression became serious. "Rosa told me everything. What you've done for Maya, taking her into your home, caring for her like she's your own daughter. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Brian said. "I made you a promise. I'm just keeping it." Eliana's eyes filled with tears. "I barely remember that night. I remember the attack, the pain, crawling to call 911. I remember seeing your face, knowing you were trying to save me. I remember being so afraid Maya would end up alone. And then—" She trailed off, wiping at her eyes with her good hand. The other arm was heavily bandaged from defensive wounds. "I don't remember what I said to you." "You asked me to promise your daughter wouldn't be alone," Brian said quietly. "You said, 'Don't let my daughter be alone.' So I promised, and I meant it." Eliana looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "Rosa says you're a single dad, that your wife died, that you have a daughter Maya's age." "Sophie, she's 7, same as Maya. They're in the same school now, different classrooms, but they ride the bus together. They've become friends. Sophie's been good for Maya. She's helped her adjust." "And you work overnight shifts as a paramedic?" "Yes. My mother Helen helps with childcare during my work hours. It's complicated, but it's working. Maya's doing okay. She misses you desperately, but she's coping. She's strong, like her mum." Eliana's tears overflowed. "I was so scared, not of dying, but of leaving her. Her dad is deployed. My mum was in rehab. There was no one. The thought of Maya in foster care with strangers, terrified and alone, it was worse than the pain of the stab wounds." "She's not alone," Brian said firmly. "And you're going to recover. You're going to go home to her. This is temporary." "What if I can't?" Eliana asked, vulnerability raw in her voice. "What if the recovery takes months? What if I can't work, can't provide for her? What if—" "One day at a time," Brian interrupted gently. "Right now, focus on healing. Maya is safe and cared for. Rosa is improving. David is working on emergency leave. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Eliana studied him, then nodded slowly. "Can I see her, Maya?" The doctor said maybe next week, when your infection risk is lower, but I'll bring her as soon as they clear it. She wants to see you so badly. She talks about you constantly." "What does she say?" Brian smiled. "She says her mom is strong, that you fight bad guys, that heroes don't give up. She's so proud of you, Eliana." Eliana covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Brian stepped closer, unsure if he should leave or stay. Finally, Eliana looked up, her face wet with tears, but also something like hope. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving my life, for keeping your promise, for giving Maya a safe place. Thank you." Maya's reunion with her conscious mother happened 5 days later, carefully supervised by medical staff in case it was too overwhelming. Brian and Sophie waited in the family lounge while Maya went in with Rosa, who'd been granted a special pass from rehab for the occasion. 30 minutes later, Maya emerged, red-eyed but smiling, clutching a get-well card she'd made in art class. "Mama's awake," she told Brian with wonder. "She talked to me. She said she loves me and she's sorry she got hurt, but she's getting better." "That's wonderful," Brian said, pulling Maya into a hug. She'd started accepting his affection over the past few weeks, no longer stiffening when he hugged her or held her hand crossing streets. Progress. Sophie bounced excitedly. "Can we make your mom more cards? I'm really good at cards. I make them for Grandma Helen all the time." "Yes," Maya agreed enthusiastically. "Let's make lots of cards." The girls spent that evening at Brian's small dining table, surrounded by construction paper and markers and glitter, creating increasingly elaborate get-well cards for Eliana. Brian watched them work while preparing dinner, his heart full of affection for both these resilient little souls. His phone rang. Detective Rodriguez. "Brian, got some news. David Diaz finally got through the Navy bureaucracy. He's flying back from Japan, should arrive in New York in 48 hours. He'll be taking Maya once he's settled." Brian felt a complicated mix of relief and unexpected sadness. That's good. Maya needs her father. Also, Eliana's being transferred out of ICU tomorrow, moving to regular floor. She's out of danger. Full recovery will take months, but she's going to make it. You saved her life, Brian. No question. After hanging up, Brian looked at the girls, still absorbed in their card-making. He'd known from the start this was temporary. Maya had a father who loved her, a mother who was recovering, a grandmother getting stronger. This was always going to end. But somehow, in 3 weeks, Maya had become part of their little family. The apartment would feel empty without her laughter, without her science experiments with Sophie, without her quiet, "Good night, Brian," before bed. He told Maya the next day, sitting her down after school with Sophie present. "Your dad is coming home, sweetheart. He'll be here in 2 days. You're going to get to see him and live with him while your mum continues recovering." Maya's face showed conflicting emotions. "I miss Daddy, but I don't want to leave Sophie, or you, or Grandma Helen." "We'll still see each other," Sophie said immediately, grabbing Maya's hand. "You're my friend. We're in the same school. We'll have play dates and everything." "Exactly," Brian said, throat tight. "This isn't goodbye forever. You're part of our family now, Maya. That doesn't change just because you go back to living with your dad." David Diaz arrived on a Tuesday evening, haggard from travel and stress. He was 32, tall and military fit, with dark hair cut short and the same dark eyes as his daughter. He'd been granted 30 days emergency leave, enough time to get Maya settled and figure out longer-term arrangements while Eliana recovered. The reunion between father and daughter was tearful and beautiful. Maya launched herself at David, sobbing, "Daddy, Daddy," while he held her and cried into her hair, telling her how much he'd missed her, how sorry he was he couldn't get back sooner. Brian gave them space, busying himself in the kitchen with Sophie, but eventually David came to find him, Maya attached to his side. "Brian Robinson," David said, extending his hand. I don't have words. What you did for my daughter, for Eliana, I can never repay that." "You don't need to," Brian said, shaking his hand. "I'm just glad Maya's okay and that you're home safe." "The Navy's being flexible," David explained. "After this deployment, I'm requesting shore duty so I can be stateside with Maya. The divorce was necessary. Eliana and I wanted different things, but we're both committed to co-parenting. I should have been here. The fact that you stepped in when neither of us could." He shook his head, emotion overwhelming him. "Maya's a special kid," Brian said. "It was an honor to take care of her." David looked at Sophie, who'd been quiet during the reunion, then back at Brian. "Maya talks about Sophie constantly. They've bonded." "They're both 7, both in 2nd grade, both love science," Brian said with a smile. "It was inevitable. I'd like them to stay friends, if that's okay with you. Play dates, getting together, that kind of thing." "Absolutely," Brian said. "Sophie would be devastated if they couldn't see each other." Maya left that night, taking her suitcases and Peanut the elephant, promising to see Sophie at school the next day. The apartment felt cavernously empty afterward. Sophie cried, though she tried to hide it. Brian held her on the couch, explaining that this was always the plan, that Maya needed her dad, that they'd still see each other. "I know," Sophie sniffled, "but I liked having a sister, even a temporary one." Me too," Brian admitted. "Me too, sweetie." Over the next 2 weeks, a new routine emerged. David had rented a small apartment in Queens near the hospital, so he could visit Eliana daily while caring for Maya. The girls saw each other at school and had playdates twice a week, alternating between Brian's and David's apartments. The fathers became friendly, bonding over single parenting challenges and shared exhaustion. Eliana continued improving, moving to outpatient rehab while living with Rosa, who'd been discharged from the hospital. David's leave would end in 2 weeks, but he'd already secured shore duty in Norfolk, Virginia, starting in 3 months. The plan was for Maya to stay with Eliana and Rosa until David's current deployment obligations ended. Then Maya would split time between her parents, school year with David in Virginia, summers and holidays with Eliana in New York. Brian continued working his overnight paramedic shifts, caring for Sophie, living his life. But something had shifted during those weeks with Maya. He'd remembered what it felt like to help someone beyond the immediate medical crisis. He'd remembered the satisfaction of making a real difference in a child's life. He'd also grown closer to Eliana through visits and phone calls, coordinating Maya's care and discussing her progress. Eliana was different than he'd expected. She was funny, despite the trauma. She was brilliant, talking about the weapons trafficking case with analytical precision. She was vulnerable, admitting fear about returning to police work, about whether her body would ever fully recover. She asked about Brian's wife, and he found himself telling her about Melissa in ways he hadn't talked to anyone in years. She was a teacher, Brian explained during one visit when Eliana was well enough for longer conversations. 4th grade. She loved science and got kids excited about learning. Sophie inherited that from her. "And you've been alone for 3 years," Eliana said quietly. "That must be incredibly hard." "I have Sophie. I have my mom. I have work. It's enough." "Is it?" Eliana asked gently. Brian didn't know how to answer that. The medal ceremony happened 6 weeks after the attack. Eliana was strong enough to attend, though she moved carefully and tired easily. The NYPD held the ceremony at one police plaza, with media present and dozens of officers in dress uniforms. Eliana received the Medal of Valor for her undercover work and bravery under attack. The police commissioner himself presented it, praising her dedication and sacrifice. Brian attended at Eliana's invitation, bringing Sophie and Maya, who'd both dressed in their nicest clothes. David was there too, in his navy dress uniform, standing beside Rosa, who'd come in her wheelchair. It felt like a family gathering, this odd configuration of people brought together by trauma and promise. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Brian found himself standing with Eliana on a quiet balcony, watching the girls play together in a corner of the room while David and Rosa talked to police officers. "I'm putting in for a transfer," Eliana said abruptly, "out of undercover work, maybe to the training academy or community outreach, something with regular hours where I'm not risking my life weekly." "Because of Maya?" Brian asked. "Because I almost left her," Eliana said. "I was lying in that alley, bleeding out, and all I could think was that Maya would be alone. I can't do that to her again. She needs a mother who comes home alive." "That makes sense," Brian said. Eliana looked at him, something vulnerable in her expression. "I also can't stop thinking about the fact that a stranger, you, cared more about my daughter's well-being in that moment than I'd considered when I took the undercover assignment. You didn't hesitate. You promised. You followed through. I've been a police officer for 8 years, and I don't think I've met many people with that kind of integrity." Brian felt his face warm. "I just kept a promise." "You did more than that. You gave Maya stability when she had none. You made her feel safe. Sophie became her friend, maybe her best friend. Your mother welcomed her. You created family for my daughter when her actual family couldn't be there. That's—" Eliana's voice caught. "That's extraordinary. Anyone would have done the same," Brian said, though he knew it wasn't true. "No," Eliana said firmly. "Most people wouldn't. Most people would have called child services and moved on with their lives. You got involved. You cared. And I—" She hesitated, then continued softly. "I'd like to get to know you better. Not as Maya's temporary guardian, not as the paramedic who saved my life, just as Brian, if you're open to that." Brian's heart stuttered. "Like dating?" Eliana smiled, the first truly open smile he'd seen from her. "Eventually, maybe, if we're compatible. But first, just friendship. Dinner sometime without the kids. Coffee. Talking about things that aren't medical updates or custody schedules. Getting to know each other as people. Would that be okay?" "Yes," Brian said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "I'd like that." Their first date happened 2 weeks later. David took both girls for a sleepover. Maya had been begging for Sophie to stay over, and David had agreed enthusiastically. Helen encouraged Brian to go, even loaning him money for a nicer restaurant than he could typically afford. "You deserve happiness," she'd said. "Melissa would want you to be happy." Brian and Eliana met at a small Italian restaurant in Manhattan, halfway between their apartments. Eliana moved slowly still, favoring her healing abdomen, but she looked beautiful in a simple blue dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. They talked for 3 hours, long past their entrees, sharing stories and discovering unexpected commonalities. Both had lost parents young. Brian's father to a heart attack when Brian was 15, Eliana's father to a line-of-duty shooting when she was 12. Both had chosen helping professions to honor those losses. Both loved their daughters fiercely and struggled with the guilt of single parenting while working demanding jobs. Both had weathered divorce and loss and come out determined to build good lives for their children. "I was married for 3 years, Eliana explained. "David and I met in college, got married too young, realized we wanted different things. He wanted military career and stability. I wanted police work and couldn't promise stability. We loved each other but couldn't make it work. The divorce was hard but amicable. We co-parent well. Melissa and I had 9 years together," Brian shared. "High school sweethearts, married at 22. We were best friends. When she got sick, it felt like the world ended. I didn't think I'd ever feel happy again. But Sophie needed me to keep going, so I did." "Do you think you could be happy again?" Eliana asked softly. With someone new? Brian considered the question honestly. 3 weeks ago, I would have said no. I thought I'd had my chance at love and it was over. But then I met you, not the way anyone expects to meet someone, and you've made me think maybe there are second chances, if you're brave enough to take them. Eliana reached across the table and took his hand. I think we're both pretty brave. We've survived things that would break most people. Maybe that means we're strong enough for this too. They dated slowly, carefully, mindful of their daughters and complicated lives. Coffee dates while the girls were in school, phone calls during Brian's breaks at work, occasional dinners when David could watch both kids. They didn't hide it from Maya and Sophie, who were thrilled their parents were friends and hopeful for more. "Are you going to marry Eliana and be Maya's dad?" Sophie asked Brian one evening with 7-year-old directness. "We're just getting to know each other," Brian said carefully. "But I really like her. Is that okay with you?" "Yes," Sophie said enthusiastically. "Then Maya would be my sister for real." 3 months after finding Eliana bleeding in that alley, Brian took her to meet Melissa's grave. It felt important, though he couldn't fully explain why. He wanted Melissa's blessing, wanted Eliana to understand the woman who'd shaped him, wanted to formally acknowledge that he was moving forward while never forgetting. They stood at the small headstone in Calvary Cemetery, Sophie and Maya playing quietly nearby among the fall leaves. Eliana read the inscription, "Melissa Robinson, beloved wife and mother, forever in our hearts." "She was beautiful," Eliana said, looking at the small photograph on the stone, "and so young." "She was 30 when she died," Brian said. "Too young, too much left to do." "Tell me about her," Eliana said gently. So Brian told her about Melissa's laugh, her terrible singing voice, her passion for teaching, about how she'd encouraged Brian to become a paramedic when he was uncertain about career paths, about her last words in the hospice. "Don't let our baby girl forget how to be happy." "I think you've honored that," Eliana said. "Sophie is happy. She's thriving. Melissa would be proud of the father you've become." "I hope so," Brian said. Then, feeling vulnerable but needing to say it, "I think she'd like you. You're strong like she was. You love your daughter the way she loved Sophie. You're brave and kind and you make me laugh. I think Melissa would approve." Eliana squeezed his hand. "I hope so too, because I'm falling for you, Brian Robinson, and I need to know that's okay. With you, with Melissa's memory, with Sophie. I don't want to be a replacement. I want to be a new chapter." "You're not a replacement," Brian said firmly. "You're exactly what you said, a new chapter. And yes, it's okay, more than okay." They kissed there among the graves and autumn leaves, a moment of new beginning in a place of endings. Sophie and Maya, seeing them, squealed with excitement and ran over to hug them both. And Brian felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years, hope for a future that included love. 6 months after the attack, Eliana returned to active duty at the NYPD, assigned to the training academy where she taught tactical operations to new recruits. Her physical recovery was 90% complete, though she'd always carry scars. Rosa had recovered enough to live independently with assistance, and Maya split time between her grandmother's apartment and David's place when he was stateside. Brian and Eliana had fallen deeply, carefully in love. They didn't rush things. Both had learned patience through loss. But they built something steady and real, brick by brick. Sophie and Maya became genuinely inseparable, functionally sisters. Helen adored Eliana and Maya both. David gave his blessing to the relationship, grateful that his daughter had such good people in her life. 1 year after finding Eliana in that alley, Brian proposed. He did it at the NYPD medal ceremony that had brought them together publicly, during a quiet moment on the same balcony where Eliana had first suggested getting to know each other. He had a simple ring, nothing fancy, bought with money he'd saved from overtime shifts, and a simple question. "You changed my life when I found you that night," Brian said. "I promised to take care of your daughter, but I didn't know that keeping that promise would lead me here. To you, to falling in love again, to believing in happy endings. Will you marry me, Eliana Diaz? Will you let me keep my promise for the rest of our lives?" Eliana cried, nodded, kissed him thoroughly. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They got married 8 months later in a small ceremony at a Queen's botanical garden. Sophie was flower girl, Maya was junior bridesmaid, and both girls cried happy tears. David attended and gave Eliana away, because despite their divorce, they remained family. Rosa sat in the front row, beaming. Helen officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for this purpose. Marcus Wu, Brian's partner, was best man. "You're a good man," Marcus said in his speech at the reception. "You keep promises. You save lives. You love fiercely. Melissa would be so proud of who you've become. And Eliana is one lucky woman." "I'm the lucky one," Eliana said, standing to respond. "Brian saved my life twice, once in that alley, and once when he kept his promise and gave my daughter a safe place to land. He showed me that second chances are real, that good people exist, that love can grow from trauma. I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of his promise." They blended their families carefully, maintaining separate apartments at first, while the girls adjusted to thinking of themselves as sisters. Eventually, after a year of marriage, they bought a small house in Queens with a backyard where the girls could play. Sophie and Maya shared a room by choice, staying up late talking and giggling the way sisters do. Brian continued working as a paramedic, but eventually took a position as an EMS training instructor, working more regular hours. Eliana loved her academy teaching, shaping new officers without risking her life nightly. David remarried, a Navy nurse he met during his shore duty, and Maya gained a stepmother she adored. Rosa became Grandma Rosa to Sophie too, loving both girls equally. The weapon trafficking ring Eliana had infiltrated led to 40 arrests and prevented hundreds of illegal firearms from reaching the streets. Eliana was promoted to sergeant and eventually lieutenant, commanding the training division. She never returned to undercover work, keeping her promise to Maya to always come home safe. Brian never forgot the promise he made that night in the rain-soaked alley. It became the foundation of his marriage, the reminder that commitment means showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. He and Eliana built their love on kept promises and second chances, on 2 daughters who became sisters, on trauma transformed into hope. 5 years after the attack, on the anniversary of the day Brian found Eliana, they returned to that alley in Long Island City. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, acknowledging the place where their lives had intersected in blood and desperation. The alley looked different in daylight, mundane and industrial, no trace of the violence that had happened there. "This is where it started," Eliana said, holding Brian's hand. "Where you saved my life, where I asked you to promise to care for Maya, where I made the best promise I ever kept," Brian said, "because it brought me you. It brought Sophie a sister. It brought all of us together." "Do you ever regret it?" Eliana asked. "Taking on Maya when you had no obligation to? Changing your entire life because of a promise to a dying stranger?" Brian pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "Never. Not for a single second. You asked me to make sure your daughter wasn't alone. But by keeping that promise, I made sure I wasn't alone either. We saved each other, Eliana. That night in the alley, you saved me as much as I saved you." They left the alley hand in hand, driving back to their house where Sophie and Maya were probably arguing over homework or fighting for bathroom time or collaborating on some elaborate science experiment. Their family, built on a promise made in the worst moment of Eliana's life, thrived in ways neither could have imagined. Brian Robinson had promised a dying cop he'd take care of her daughter. But what he didn't know then, what he learned over the months and years that followed, was that sometimes keeping a promise to save someone else is actually the first step in saving yourself. Sometimes the people you're meant to love enter your life in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes the best families are the ones built not by blood, but by choice, commitment, and promises kept even when it costs you everything. The NYPD gave Brian a civilian commendation for his actions that night, recognizing that his quick response and determination had saved Detective Diaz's life. He kept the certificate in his office at the EMS training center, next to a photo from his and Eliana's wedding. In the photo, Sophie and Maya stand between them, all four holding hands, all four smiling. A family born from tragedy, a love born from promise, a future born from choosing to care even when it would have been easier to walk away. That's the story of how single dad Brian Robinson found dying officer Eliana Diaz in an alley at 3 a.m., made a promise in the rain, and ended up with everything he'd thought he'd lost forever: love, family, and the certainty that sometimes the hardest promises are the ones most worth keeping. And what shocked the entire police force wasn't just that a stranger had kept his word to a dying cop. It was that the promise had transformed into something beautiful, a love story that proved heroes don't just wear badges. Sometimes heroes are paramedics working overnight shifts, keeping promises to people they barely know, because that's what good people do. They save lives, they keep promises, they build families from broken pieces. And sometimes, if they're very lucky, they get to build a lifetime with the person they saved, making every day a renewal of that first desperate promise. I'm here. You're not alone. We're in this together, forever.